Maybe it's already open sometimes.
Great, here we go. So we talked earlier about incentives for the workforce. So their incentive is to put me between you and lunch so that I don't talk too long about data strategies and acquisition, digital acquisition. So we talked a little bit about it earlier. We wanted to give you more of a taste of the specific side of the data strategy so that you could get a feel for where we're headed, the ideas that we have. We're all ears for recommendations and suggestions, both from the academic community on what we could do to improve the data strategy, as well as from the department and industry about practical issues, ideas of things that we can put in there. We're intending it to be a living document, but we want to get the first version as well as possible. So I'm going to spend a little time on that. So you saw this slide a little bit earlier. Again, we're looking at digital acquisition as a goal of really trying to think about how can data help us improve acquisition. It's an offshoot of the data strategy for the Department of Defense that's out there. That really lays out sort of a high-level vision, if you will, and some data principles, but it doesn't really tell us, well, okay, how do we actually do that in acquisition? So that's our job. So we're developing strategies and tools. Laura actually gave you some examples of the kinds of things that we're grappling with now as we go through it, and she'll give you some more examples in a little while. And then again, what kind of data do we need to answer the kinds of questions and the kinds of functions that we're thinking about? There actually was an acquisition data and analytics strategy implementation plan for acquisition and sustainment that came out last year. It laid out a lot of these basic principles, so we're leveraging that and building upon that to move forward. Wanted to also emphasize this isn't just about OSD, this is really about the department writ large. So we're working to reach out to stakeholders and would like to make certain that we get the right folks. So for those of you that are in the department, please help us connect with the right people in the components so that we can reflect your needs and make certain that the strategy is there for you. As Mr. O'Donnell indicated earlier in our keynote, why are we doing this? We're really doing this because we're trying to think about how can we make acquisition better, not just faster, not just more cost-effective, but also to address threats and have those capabilities there when the warfighters need it so that we can be reactive to those threats. We think there really is a tremendous opportunity out there in trying to think through differently how can we actually do the functions. We still know we have to do cost estimating, we have to do contracting, but can we make them better by providing more data or different types of data to help rethink those functions. So we're laying out a vision and a strategy, a roadmap to get signed out by ANS in the wintertime. We're going through these kinds of forums to collect input. We have another sort of working level brainstorming session on December 8th to think about transformation, look at best practices, and get more feedback. And then these are the types of acquisition outcomes that we're really targeting for. It's not only acquisition, but it's also interfaces with the requirements community, with the financial management community, because those are key inputs that we need to be able to produce acquisition. When acquisition community doesn't build anything on its own, I have to have the money, I have to have the requirement and the underlying intelligence to be able to move forward. So it addresses all of these particular areas and the kinds of functions, again, that Mr. O'Donnell talked about. For example, how do I think about it from a mission perspective? Not, I have a helicopter, well, okay, that's not going to win the war with a helicopter. How does it fit into a larger context? And how do I think through that? We are working to define what we mean by digital acquisition, so we went ahead and put together a draft definition for that, and has key elements in there. So we're really thinking about, again, the types of data. It's really more than just what I would normally think of as data is really information. It could be models as a different type of information. It's not just documentation. And then providing analysis and making it available to the right people so that we can go off and have an impact. We want to enable and empower people to change, to think about different ways of innovating. And we want to be able to apply it at all kinds of different levels, the decision level, the policy level, the particular functions that are going on and processes within the area, and then always focusing on the net outcome to the warfighter, not necessarily the net outcome to our own individual function or our own individual organization. Of course, there are challenges that are out there. Pervasiveness by itself is a challenge, and Mr. Crisco and the department's been grappling with that for a long time, really trying to figure out, well, how do I make it accessible? How do I federate the data? How do I share it? How do I ensure its quality, make certain that we can get access to it? There's the flip side of that. We always have to think about security. Who really should have access to these data? How do I protect it? And that's always in the back of, I think, a lot of people's mind about restricting access as well. Wait a minute, what are you going to do with this? How do you have a need to know? Do you have the right credentials and so on? So we're weaving that into it, and in fact, some of the research that Laura's going to talk about a little bit later we're thinking about new mechanisms how we can actually get access to information while still protecting the information that's there. And then really the culture of sharing, many of you may know that the Department of Defense really has this disincentive and this pushback. I need the data for my purposes, but I don't want to share it up a next level, and that recursively applies all the way through the system. You'll get the PEOs complaining that they can't get the right data from the PMs and the oversight people from the PEOs and so on, in part because of a lot of the incentive structures that we've set up that we're worried about what people are going to do with the data and whether it's going to help them or not. And yet we think there are a lot of opportunities. Again, the technology, we have some innovative ideas that are going there. We're really trying to focus on functions, so it's not about OSD and congressional oversight as the main focus. We really want to try to think about where the acquisition's really happening, so down at the program level, down at the functionals and the staff level. And then this is all in alignment, amazingly enough, with where the Deputy Secretary Hicks is going through. There's been a lot of drives in the department to focus on data and saying, we think we can get a lot out of it. I mentioned that there are a lot of strategies out there. I'm not going to go through the principles, but we're leveraging these strategies and principles as we go through our document. We build a strategy. We're always in the background asking ourselves, well, what does this really mean? What do we mean by linked? What do you mean by trustworthy? So we're trying to use that as a way to move it forward and seek that clarity as we go through it to try to achieve practical benefits. So here's a picture of where we are, I think, in the short term and the near term. So back 11 years ago or 10 years ago when I was in the Pentagon trying to do analysis and trying to get access to data, I would call up Mr. Crisco and say, great, the boss asked me to analyze a particular question. How do I get access to the data? And we were manually copying things off of screens, if you can believe it. So there's been a lot of effort to open up data sets, to share them, at least the cost, schedule, performance kinds of data that are out there. So the databases are now open to a large extent. They're sharing. There's a new system called Advana to make that data available, at least some subsets of it in a centralized location. It's all secure behind .mil firewalls that Laura and I are still working to get access to, but at least it's there. I mean, if you're in the building, you're a white badger, you can get access to these data, and you have a much better ability to do assessments, to look across programs, look for trends and areas where we can improve it. Digital acquisition, I scratched my head and said, well, what does that mean? I mean, we're all working in Word documents and Excel spreadsheets and whatnot. It's electronic, right? Is that what we're talking about? We are, to a large extent, we're an electronic-based department. We print things out, but we build them on the computer. They have some structured data sets, so if I'm working in a spreadsheet, right, I can have some structured elements where we're defining it, like the contract information that Laura's team was pulling down. Sometimes it's unstructured, so we have free text boxes where the program manager can put anything in it. We at least now have better tools to be able to filter through it, to be able to try to, look for sentiment in the context, trying to understand what's there versus always having to have a human being go and read the raw text, what's there. That's where we are now. A lot of activity in trying to move in those directions. We have a lot of data. Some of the data are useful for other purposes. Can't we just open them up? Open up better APIs, federate the information so that it can be shared to support the full range of acquisition functions that here, again, representing in the green box. Here's a different vision about where we might go. So continue to work on the opening of the data sets. There are a lot more data out there than cost schedule performance data. So go to the other end of the acquisition. Sustainment is really, by definition, part of acquisition. What information is out there? Can we open those data that talk about reliability? That's what's going on in the repair depots. So there's a lot of activity there to try to make those linkages and more progress to be made out there. But we talked a little earlier about model-based acquisition. So, right, the systems engineering world saying, well, let's build this model. Here's a model of this thing that I think I want to be able to acquire. What can I do with that? Well, I can take that model and go upwards. I can think about system of systems. Now I have a representation of each of those different elements. So from a modeling perspective, I can think about missions, I can think about kill chains, I can think about interoperability, not based on paper descriptions of the items that we're talking about acquiring, but this model, I can actually do simulations of that. There'll be some discussions later this afternoon about ideas about how we can do that. That model could be handed to contractors. So instead of handing them a piece of paper with a number of requirements on it, go build me, again, a helicopter, and here's the range and flight capabilities and lift capabilities and so on. Here's a model. This is the model that I want you to go off and build in some level of abstract. They could use that to build their own contracting proposal model. Okay, given that representation, here's the helicopter I propose building, and here's how much I think I need to be able to acquire it. We can let a contract and say, great, that's our basis in the contract is actually a model versus a requirement specification listed out in a contracting diagram. So they can then take that and build the actual diagram, the design model, to go off and understand each of the individual elements. Of course, then they proceed to production, they go and deliver the system, we field the system, we have operations. And then from that we get the outcomes from the system. That goes back through the normal feedback loop, so senior levels and the presidents and the executive branch and legislative branch, really trying to understand, okay, that's the outcomes. What's really going on? Is it satisfactory? Is there a new threat that's out there? What do we need to do? So the interface between that and the other parts of the Department of Defense, so the requirements community, the financial management community, the intel community, really could all think about these capabilities, again, from this model-based representation of the capability or a digital twin, as we talked about earlier. So there's a nice ability to fundamentally think about from that perspective. And then that model-based system can actually be used to go through particular functions. How do I think about T&E? How do I think about sustainment? Is there a problem in sustainment because my digital twin indicates I should go off and build this motor, or maybe the motor's just fine? Where are the problems? How do we go through and improve in pretty much any of those functions based on that model? There's still other areas where we need to share more information. So earned value management data, we're still using that to try to understand production, where we are in terms of status. That's an information sharing system that we have now. More opportunities, I think, to share that information so that we can understand what's happening in production, and the contractors can use that as a tool to understand where they are. We talked about the IP repository. The department pays for some level of intellectual property. Well, did we get it? Did we store it anywhere? Do we know what IP we have? Sometimes we may pay for it and not get it because it's hard to track. So just trying to think about managing IP. The contracting and industry will manage it internally, but do we have our representation of the IP that we own? What exact data rights did we get? Which ones didn't we get? Can we share it with someone else to go off in sustainment and rebuild the landing gear, or did we not buy that capability? So trying to think again, how do we manage it from that level to be able to use that and have that information readily available. And so really thinking about, again, things like model-based acquisitions. This is just one example. So the question was sort of throwing out the gauntlet of what else can we do to help improve acquisition? Are there other concepts that are out there that we can put into the strategy as we move forward? In AIRC, what we're doing is we're working with the department to think through these ideas, helping to draft statements, helping to think through roadmaps and opportunities. So we have a activity going on at that level, thinking strategically about it. But we also have other research activities that are ongoing now that some of which we'll be able to report out next year in the AIRC Day. So for example, looking at the requirements process and the interface between pieces of the department relative to the requirements activity and setting requirements, as well as the interface with acquisition. So that as a key element to producing new systems in a quick way. If it takes us 2 years to get a requirement, it's going to be delayed 2 years. So can we improve that as an input? Can we look at the financial management? So we talked a little bit earlier about flexibility, single color of money, for example, for software. So are there ways that we can construct and acquire resources from Congress in a way that's structured that allows us some flexibility? If we have a new threat, we have a new idea, we can quickly go and fund it. What are those ideas? So we have some functions for that. Can we actually track the spending of money? If you've been in the building, it's really hard, unless you're in the comptroller's office, to track where the money is gone. It gets moved to different activities. Laura indicated earlier, right? Air Force money got sent to the Navy to do a contract action. It's now one or multiple steps through the system. So we're looking at whether a blockchain data structure could help us actually track it as the money moves down through the system. Do we have one corpus information that would allow us to very rapidly say, but that Air Force money now went to the Navy, who then, by the way, sent it to the Army, who then did the contracting action, and it's now on Project X, Y, or Z. We have other activities that are ongoing, and we're going to give you some previews this afternoon about how can we use model-based systems engineering for portfolio management, so prototyping in that particular area. We have some activities specific to individual functions, so can we apply new training techniques for, say, contracting officers? So we have an active project ongoing now looking at gaming technologies for training on new areas that contracting officers may not be familiar with. Can we provide what's called a cognitive assistant? So while let's say a cost estimator is actually on the job doing their work, to provide advice about new ways of thinking about cost estimating, or even reinforcing the basic principles. Looking at, again, intellectual property management and maybe continuing those areas. And then other technologies in the sustainment realm, for example, looking at can we do additive manufacturing in sustainment in the field? There's a lot of activity going on in the different components, thinking about that. Is there a structural strategic approach that could help move that forward in the building? So that's what I have, and I'm going to turn it over to Laura to give you some more specific ideas of some of the research areas that we're going to be doing research on to, again, try to make this real in addition to the higher level picture, but give us some really grounded activities about, well, how are we going to solve some of these problems, applying ideas out of academia. So, Laura?
Thanks, Phil. So I love the vision that Phil paints for where we're going in the future. What I'm going to focus on is how do we, start to make those first steps towards that vision. And so, kind of following in the nature of our IP repository task, we've identified a few areas where we think there's going to be value in acquiring data, models, information around solving acquisition problems. And so what we've got is we say 12 months by 2. I think that's what we agreed to, but we'll do as many as we possibly can because more data is better. But essentially what we have laid out is that, we're going to identify these key problems, and we need the government's help on identifying those key problems. We need the stakeholders to help, meet with us biweekly and talk us through what the challenges are. And we've got an initial list here today that we're gonna work on executing, but if there's others out there, this is not set in stone. As Phil said, all of this is living. And so if you have ideas that come to your mind, whether you're on the government or the academic side, please capture Phil, capture myself, and let's talk about them while we're here or afterwards. And so as we develop that plan, we're going to figure out what those problems are, those are the goals, and then figure out data access management, how we're going to interface with it, and what analytical tools are needed to make sure that we are set up for success when we go to execute our pilots. So executing the pilots is figuring out the data collection, the curation, the analysis, and then of course we want every AIRC project to result in a prototype, something that someone can interact with, understand what's going on, ask their own questions of the data and the tools. We'll deploy those to the website, make downloads available, kind of going to that common, if we know where to find the information, we know how to access it, that's going to allow us to expand our impact. We'll get feedback, identify additional use cases, and then also update the strategic plan as we're thinking about it. So I'm sure every pilot we go through will learn something, and that will be another hook that we put on the strategic plan around acquisition innovation and acquisition data strategy. So the initial pilot options, which are, this is, maybe the best that our kind of limited group could come up with, and I'm very excited to see what others can bring to the table in terms of our initial pilots. But these are what we have identified and we're working on right now. So the first one, clearly stemming from our experiences in kind of IP access, is we want to have plans in place for the future for how we access sensitive data, whether it's IP, whether it's CUI, whether it's classified in some way. We need to have a kind of a menu list of items for the government to say, hey, this data could help us answer these questions, but we know it needs to be protected. Here are the different things that we could do. So this is one of the first ones that we're tackling. We're looking at everything from the obvious, like just delete that row of data, and then the data set's fine. That was the sensitive row, just delete it. So very manual options, to things that are a little bit more process in nature. We got a brief from a team at Georgetown that has done this with PHI, where they host the data in a black box that cannot be accessed. And what the research community does is they kind of do research and negotiate around the algorithms that go into the black box. So the data stays protected, the algorithms go in, and what comes out doesn't have that PHI information associated with that. So that's a process kind of approach to this, where you need to understand the data well enough that you can write an algorithm to go in and do something meaningful. You need to understand the data quality well enough that if there's missing data, how you're going to deal with it, because you're not going to be able to do that on the fly as an analyst. But you can protect the data, and they've been able to do this with PHI data, which obviously is very sensitive and controlled, and so that's an option that we can put out there. And then finally, what I'll categorize as more algorithmic approaches, things like differential privacy, where you're adding noise to the data in a systematic way that keeps the sensitive pieces from being identified. And so we're looking at mapping kind of that universe of options so that we have the processes in place that when the next IP repository or some CUI information comes along, we can say, here are the different approaches you can take to anonymize it, and they have been proven out, and we have the processes in place. So that's the first piece that we're looking at. The other use cases that we're talking about are actually much more, that's kind of a global problem, if you will. The other ones we're looking at are more kind of user-focused problems in acquisition right now. So my former life, I was a tester, and so this one resonates with me because I've often wondered, does anyone use the data that comes out of OT, operational test and evaluation? And Phil did. He wanted the reliability data all the time, but does it get used more widely? And if it could be used, is it meaningful? Are the operational tests that we're conducting real enough that they could be predictive for system performance and operations and sustainment? And so this is another use case that we're looking at, which will also require us to think about how do we cross boundaries. So operational tests conducted by the operational test agencies, overseen by Director of Operational Test and Evaluation. but who has the sustainment data? That's going to be more focused in CAPE and within the services. And so you have to cross those boundaries in terms of data to be able to pull these together. And so that's a defining case that we want to hit in our use cases as well. How do we get organizations that are currently not necessarily set up to share data, sharing that data, because that's going to enable the wider vision that Phil's laid out. The next use case that I think this is Phil's brainchild is the PM software suite for seamless reporting. And so this gets to, the PM has responsibilities that they need to be reporting out in terms of oversight responsibilities, as well as just understanding where their program is sitting. So cost, schedule, performance as the high-level metrics and the more detailed information that supports those types of things. Can we generate a software suite that allows kind of the dashboarding for the PM to do those? And then the last piece is something that I think this speaks to the connectivity of the AIRC, because while this is kind of time sequence for after some of these initial tasks that Phil was just talking about get kicked off, how do we then take those tasks? So Dan's going to talk a little bit about mission engineering and digital, or to support portfolio analysis, and is working on that. How do we take what Dan and Jitesh and that team do and translate that into this data capability that we need kind of more widely? And so looking across all the different tasks that have been set up under the AIRC, how do we think about this model-based acquisition in terms of digital twins, portfolio management, and mission engineering, and translate that into a leave behind in our digital data strategy? So that's what we've identified so far. As I said, this is a living document, a living list. I think we maybe have changed some of these bullets in the last couple weeks. And so would be curious to feedback or people who might want to, on the government side, champion, spearhead, want a pilot option that relates to these or is different from the list that we've pulled out. So the next piece that I want to talk about is not just kind of the targeted pilots that we're doing, but also how do we create this innovation ecosystem? So one of the things that we are launching actually right now this semester is the Data Grand Prix. And our goal is really to reduce barriers, access to knowledge of operational problems, and that data that academia is going to need to provide insight to the DoD. And so we've set this up as a competition where it's got 3 heats associated with it. And academic teams that are faculty-led are going to be engaging with DoD problems and hope to solve those challenges. We're taking a bootstrapped approach. That's part of our 3-heat process. Heat 1 is ongoing right now, and that's really identifying problems, understanding data available, and working through the data access issues. But a key piece to this as well is engaging with those problem owners. So our first sponsor of our Data Grand Prix is DLA. And one of the really unique things that I think they've done for the government folks that are engaging with us is they've given them time buyouts to actually be able to participate and incentivize them to spend the time getting our academics smart on what DLA challenges are. And through this, we hope to both build excitement around, on the government side, hey, it's really fun to engage with academia. They have some novel ideas for solving my big challenges. And on the academic side, build appreciation for what those big challenges are and how their research can help tackle them. And our goal is to then expand. So right now we're working through NDAs on the Heat 1, but just like with all the other data strategy and repository efforts, we want to then open source our findings and engage across academia and across the government to come play in this Data Grand Prix. So here's the campaign of problem solving that we have structured for this first phase. So we're currently in Heat 1, which is the planning phase where we're working with the DLA government team. They've done a great job proposing some data science objectives, identifying what data sources are available, the restrictions to access. They put together a very lengthy document really laying out the whole challenge. And we're working through that with the academic team right now who are thinking about how did they access, what kind of research methods would they bring to bear. And at the end of Heat 1, we're going to pull all that together into a white paper. I know it's not a prototype, but hopefully the white paper will then be something that we can open up to a larger community in Heat 2, where we're looking at scaling access, sharing of real or transformed or synthetic data. I left synthetic data off my data access, but that's another one we're looking at, the generation of synthetic data that mimics the real stuff. And so how do we break down those barriers, help develop the methods and the tools through these different types of access mechanisms, and bringing kind of a wide view of academia to bear there. And then Heat 3 will really kind of finalize the cycle, where there we're actually implementing the analytics, we're building dashboards, we're prototyping, and those will, and kind of a rinse and repeat. So at any point, we could start with a new government problem owner on a new competition. So here's what the Heat 1 problems are that we're tackling. We right now have 4 teams and 4 problem owners. I mentioned they were faculty-led. Some of them are faculty and research teams. Others are faculty and student teams. And they'll be submitting by the end of this semester. And you can see there the 4 operational problems that they're working with DLA on: operational sustainment mapping, lead time variability modeling, purchase request workload management tools, and industrial capability program production input material identification. That's a mouthful. And so those are the operational challenges that our academic teams are engaging on right now. So taking this back to the larger data strategy, we want to make sure that we are leaving technical artifacts behind in kind of every product that we're developing or project that we're executing within the AIRC. And so I've defined these in kind of our data strategy task as different pieces of this. So of course there's the data itself, the different data sources. So there might be generating of new data, the data Grand Prix, and kind of engagement with different organizations that have data to bring to this data ecosystem, as well as synthetic data generation, all the anonymization things that we talked about. But also a big thing is the department starts to think about machine learning and artificial intelligence, and maybe there's something that brings to bear in terms of our policy simulations, and can we predict future outcomes. Labeling capabilities are things we're thinking about under the data strategy. And to really expand on the labeling capabilities, really curation in general. How do we take, one of our speakers earlier said there's an immense amount of data out there, but most of it isn't analysis ready. So how do we start to take that data and curate it so that it is closer to analysis ready? The next piece of our technical artifacts that we're thinking about is the infrastructure and the environment. So publicly available information, where do we host that? How do you access it through the AIRC website? Links and access connection points from that to, not directly, I'm not saying let's link directly, but that we don't do that in a black box, that we link that with knowledge of what's available in MilCloud, in Advana, in Dart, in Dave, and whatever cheetahs, the TRMC capability out there, so that we have kind of that knowledge of what's out there and we're not reproducing things, but also if we want academia to engage, we're going to have to figure out the access piece, and that's going to need to be separate from what the department, unless we're all going to get cat cards, or the department's going to go in a new way for data access. It might have to be outside, and so making sure that that's linked, but also that we have an environment for academic research and acquisition. We want to make sure that all of this coordinates, though. So you can see, I love, as a statistician, data science type, everyone's little cloud bubbles that show all the different tools that you have in there. But they are actually kind of helpful to think, okay, well, how is this architected? What's the infrastructure? When I'm building my tools, what capability should I be in Python? Should I be in R? Are you in a cluster environment or are you not? And so all of that, I think, needs to be coordinated so at least we can kind of talk back and forth between our platforms. And then finally, really where the work of data science and machine learning comes in are those analytical tools. We like to always put all of our things in Jupyter notebooks so you can understand our process, as well as here's all the code that we used. So what are those analytical tools that we're using, and having a repository of those, as well as the new research in terms of methods and models. So those are all the technical artifacts that we're thinking about when we think about data strategy under the AIRC. And so I'll build this out. What we're kind of bringing it all back together, we want these data and analytic tests to inform decision making, ultimately. And so we've got our decision makers on the left-hand side, left-hand side of the screen, and they can directly interact with a lot of this information. The CUI, the PII, the classified, IP, that's controlled in different ways. But we have our AIRC in the original legislation, and kind of by nature, academia is external to a lot of these processes in the department. And so thinking about how we both leverage publicly available acquisition-related data, as well as provide not kind of the solid line, but the dotted line in appropriate levels of protection and appropriate environments, the ability for these external analysts to explore innovative methods, explore kind of new policy simulation capabilities, as we heard about earlier, and have data feedback into them that's reflective of the real world, is some of the work that we need to do. And of course, we talked a little bit about how we need to be using kind of cutting edge and current techniques in extraction of documents and machine learning and AI techniques for kind of understanding what's in large amounts of acquisition documents. So developing those new methods and models and applying kind of the current state of the art in academia to DoD documents. And all of that becomes a source of input to the decision makers. So maybe there's some external analysts that have only kind of the publicly available information, but they have the real problem. And they're developing methods that can then be passed over to the decision makers that can then access the protected information, apply those methods, and see if they get outcomes that help in their decision-making process. And then there's maybe some that, analysts within the AIRC that sit on that line and can have access and make sure that those kind of information gets flowed back and forth to the government directly is our vision for how we support the department on the whole in terms of supporting their decision-making and innovation around acquisitions. All right, so where are we going? I outlined some of the pilot cases that we've identified. We're starting with that black box one, and we are looking to complete kind of the review and all the different approaches, and then actually do the prototyping piece where we test it and see if we can make that data available. That'll be fun to try and submit that for public release. And so I'm sure there will be lessons learned and things that we work through once we anonymize the data appropriately. We're also looking at our additional prototypes going forward, the predicting system performance from OT data sets, model-based acquisition. That's kind of the current plan. It says current plan, but it's subject to change, right? But in the near term, we have a few other opportunities for engagement. We're hosting a workshop on December 8th, where we'll invite government and what we're calling transformation leaders from both industry and government roles to talk about how they made the jump to a digital environment within their corporations, within their organizations in the government, as well as functional leads from across A&S to talk about the challenges that they have and where they might need help. So come see Phil or myself or Kara about more information on that workshop. We're working on updating kind of input to the DoD strategy and querying all the different strategies out there to make sure we've got all the best practices. And as Phil was saying earlier, what you want your data to be visible. What does that actually mean? What are the tactical things that you need? Or you want it to be accessible. Okay, how do we do that? Where does the data sit? How do you access it? Does it stay in one place or does it go with whoever's trying to access it? All those are questions that need to be answered. And so you can see here we're looking at data access as well. So we have the public data list, which we haven't talked about yet, but Phil came up with a great mechanism for all publicly available data around acquisitions. What is it? Follow the money? Follow the money, follow the contracts, follow the people. Yeah, follow the money, follow the contracts, follow the people. And has identified lots of data sets that will help you do that. So we've made some of the contracting data very easily accessible, but there's other data sets out there, and that data set is available. We'll be doing a version 1.0 of our dashboarding capability to allow you to interact with some of this publicly available data in December. And then, of course, pending great success in our black box analytic engines, that will be our next step forward, is how do we make that information accessible, or where do we put that information if we can't make it fully widely accessible. And so that's where we are going. And then our last slide is, the reason we're here today talking about the data strategy, the grand vision, is we need your inputs. And as Phil indicated earlier, we need inputs from the DoD. What are those use cases that you could use some engagement with academia and help addressing? What other conceptual approaches could improve acquisition? And then finally, what enabling data tech barriers are you facing, and why is it important to break those down? We'll add, of course, that on the academic side, if there's something you're already doing in research that relates to solving these acquisition grand challenges, how could we help you? What data have you been stymied against accessing? Or maybe you have it all and you want to bring it to bear on the AIRC work. So I think it kind of goes both ways from the government and the academic side. We need to be thinking about this larger strategy and how we improve acquisition outcomes. And what are the tools and the levers that each of us bring to bear in solving those problems? So with that, Phil, do you have any closing comments? Or we can both answer questions. I'll defer all hard ones to Phil.
There's a few questions. Which is the best way? Ask them over there? Okay, good. I did want to say, though, that we have the team that is tackling the data strategy issue was a team that was in some ways hand-selected by Mark. And in some ways, that's really terrific for the academic community, because for some of you who do not know Laura, she's a good ambassador on both sides of the fence, the government side as well as the academic side. And so if we had to have a faculty member who was at the tip of the spear to try and figure this out on our behalf, we couldn't have a better team than Laura and Phil. And so I'm grateful to both of them for all the frustration they're going through, so that some of the rest of us don't have to. So I'll just, that's my suck up for today. So. A few questions. The first question is for Laura. Laura, did you look at drawing data from the EDA?
Yes, we did. Yeah, the types of, so we did look in the major limitation was we couldn't get into so I assume this is in reference to the intellectual property data set in particular.
Yeah.
And so that data is still not accessible by us in academia without CAT cards. But yes, I think John Waskow said that to me almost every day. This data is in EDA. And I was like, great, John. So that is on our radar, and we are looking at how we access the right information.
What drove you using SAM over USA funding, USA spending, sorry?
I wish I had a more intelligent answer, but just that was we were looking at the beta.sam.gov approach, and that there were multiple kind of sources that were feeding into there. But we did also look at USA spending, and that was something we could add in the future.
Okay. So now the next few questions relate to this last briefing on the data management and analytics strategy. What do you think we need to do differently to enable us to handle AI, and more specifically to give us rights to information to evaluate AI, particularly in the case of black box systems?
You want to start, or do you want me to? Okay. So the AI question, I think, is a really important one from the acquisition perspective, and that historically the department has, coming back to IP and what we contract from a technical data rights perspective, and where current projects are in the department in terms of how they are acquiring AI, is that we are going for, as was raised by Richard earlier, commercial solutions. And the commercial industry is really driving a lot of the innovation in AI. And so what I think that means in terms of thinking about how we acquire AI, what data we need for AI, the implications are multifold. I was on a panel talking about how we do test and evaluation for AI a little while back. And one of the things that we reflected on is who should own the data for AI. And I think it is very important for the government to own at least some of the data. And one of my panelist members from DSTL in the UK equated it to lower level technical data rights or lower level requirements. That if you don't own the data, that even if the algorithm's black box, if you own the data, to some extent you know what it's learned from. Even if the vendors are using synthetic data to augment that in some way, you understand kind of the core building blocks of what you, the government, have said, this is how we're going to use it. And the industry developer can be trying to augment that in some way and improve their algorithms even further. But you have that kind of lower level requirement that has been set. And I really appreciated that perspective, that there needs to be some government ownership and also government explicit statement in the requirements that this is how we're going to use this AI algorithm. On the kind of getting to the second part of the question on kind of how do we acquire AI in these black box systems, I think and again, I'm biased by my experiences, but as a tester before this, I think the need for rigorous test and evaluation is even greater in these black box systems. We need to have enough information so that decision makers in the department can say, yes, I'm ready to field this system to this environment, and they can define what that environment is, and then say, if your environment changes from Afghanistan to wherever else in the world we're operating, you need to know how those algorithms are going to perform in new environments. And that, to me, is in a very rigorous test and evaluation capability, again, with government control and access to the data. And so that is, that brings it all together. Contracting, data rights, who owns the data, and how do we think about acquiring these things? So that's my 2 cents on a topic I'm way too passionate about.
Yeah, so I would just add that we could spend all day talking about the challenges of testing, of which Laura is the resident expert here. But think about AI as it's a system that's trained on data. We don't really know how it works within the system. It's not transparent, right? It's not really explainable in the way we wish it would be. So there are those challenges. AI can be fragile, even though it can do wonderful things. It can still be fragile and make mistakes. So you have to think about its operational context and what do we want to let it do? Where do we have to have oversight? We don't want it shooting people and so on. We need to make certain that the right decisions are made. So there's a large area of really thinking about those areas. To some degree, people adapt too, so we have to trust them, and we trust them in certain ways before we deploy them in certain areas. So there's hope for that. But I also wanted to hit on we are using AI to help acquisition. You can acquire AI, or you can use it inside acquisition. So there's some interesting results from a few research teams I'm aware of that have looked at, for example, program manager reports. For those of you in the department, here's my report for the status of my program for the month, green, yellow, red. And you go through and you say, well, I don't have time to read all the greens, just show me the yellows and the reds. Well, if you went and read the greens, are some of them indicating things that are coming up that maybe you really ought to know about? You can actually, for example, in this example, apply AI techniques for sentiment analysis and pick out things. So we've done some of this in one of my prior lives and others as well. And you can go in and say, well, read them. You say, yeah, I don't know, I guess I would have called that one yellow too. But there's an association when you flag that, yes, my program is yellow. You get a lot of love that you may not necessarily want. Maybe I can fix it or not. But there are ways of thinking about these unstructured data and processing them. And there are some great AI tools out there. And so this is a lot of in the realm of predictive analytics. AI is one tool in our toolbox to be able to do that. Can I get the data that I have within the system, my earned value data or in other areas? And is there an indication that there's something astray in there, A? And B, is there something I can do about it, or do I just need to let the trust the program manager to go off and deal with it. So it's a pretty rich environment, and again, both sides of the house, and we're trying to think through how to apply it in those areas smartly.
The next question is from Brian Novotny. Are we exploring opening up contractor models so we can use best-of-breed modules?
I think so. I probably should defer to someone who's an expert on the modeling side. Tom or someone else would know. But I believe that there's from the model-based systems engineering, yes, that model of this helicopter that we're building is much richer than my DoD model.
Yeah.
And I really need to understand what it is that they're actually building. And that's ultimately the digital twin as the acquisition goes forward.
I think in the interest of time, there's one more question I'll ask both of you. Is there a strategy to simplify contracts to enable improved operational and functional interpretation?
I think there are, both within the department, and there are some folks in academia that we've talked to as well, to, as they move forward in contract writing systems, to simplify it, to make certain that I don't just get a PDF and EDA that I can't get a hold of anyways, but how do I improve the process of doing contracting? Can I build templates so that I can, I've done this contract 50 times, do I have to really write it from scratch, or can I build from modules and templates? So I think there's work inside the building. I'm a little less familiar with exactly where we are in terms of the contract writing systems, but other ideas in academia about, there should be ways of simplifying this to help both speed the process and make certain that we get the right clauses and the right language on these contracts to improve the quality.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you.